Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we're bringing you another great Kentucky history episode, and we're delighted to have Eugene Procknow, author of The William Hunter Story, a British soldier's son who became an early American. He's joining us today, and Gene is a writer and historian focusing on the American Revolution. His expertise shows in his contributions to the Journal of the American Revolution, a publication renowned for its insight into this pivotal period of U.S. history. Gene has written over 20 scholarly articles published since 2013, many of which is also featured in the annual volume of the Journal of the American Revolution. Mr. Procknow, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jameson. I very much appreciate being here.
Well, I always like to start off with kind of having the guest tell us about their Kentucky connection. I know you're in Washington, but just real quickly tell us a bit about your history and so forth, and your connection to, the Revolutionary War and those sorts of things as well.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that I'm an historian of the American Revolution, which is my passion and my full-time pursuit now. People don't realize this, but Kentucky has played a huge role in the American Revolution. And you always think about Lexington and Concord, and for a period of time I lived in Boston, and that's how I first got involved in the Revolution. But Kentucky has played a major role in the Revolution. So I've got interested in the state, through that, and following some of the people there that emigrated after the Revolution into Kentucky. So as we'll get into it, the story that I wrote about here has a major Kentucky impact and theme. And so it's really kind of a quintessential Kentucky story.
Well, yeah, and I agree with you a bunch. Kentucky played a big role in the Revolutionary War, oftentimes overlooked, and I get it. Like you said, Lexington, Concord, Valley Forge, all those are the big ones, and people, rightfully so, check those out. But there was a Western Front in Kentucky that a lot of stuff happened.
Yes.
Anyway, so let's start a little bit about William Hunter, Finding Free Speech. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about where you can get it, but thank you for sending us the book. A very good read, very historical, a great story. Like you said before we got on, the importance of telling this story. So real quickly, what kind of inspired you to write the book? What made you want to get this story out there?
Okay. Well, the book's origin story, it's always good to know how a book came about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Its origin story. But this origin story is just by one word, it was serendipity. I went to a party at the dinner that was invited as a dinner guest to a neighbor's house. I sat next to a woman that I didn't know. And that woman asked me, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually changing careers at this point in time. I was changing careers into become an historian." And she says, "Well, we have a diary in our family possession. We don't really know what it is. Would you like to take a look at it?" So I jumped at that opportunity. And what I found was a 33-page diary, and it was written in beautiful 18th century script, almost calligraphy type script. But it was missing the first several pages. And so there was no name on the diary. And so I had to figure out who this person was. And it was a story about a boy that lived through the American Revolution. And his father was a sergeant in the British 26th Regiment of Foot. that fought against Americans, and we'll get into some of the Kentucky connections. But they fought against battles that were on the Patriots side, commanded by Kentuckians.
Oh,
So it's a really fascinating story of someone that fought against America, but then came back to America. But what I was able to do was to piece together from the facts in the diary and figure out. I went through all of the sergeants in the 26th Regiment of Foot. I figured out which ones were married, which ones
mhm.
had brought their wife to the 13 colonies, and which ones had children here. And I was able to do that. And then at the end of the diary, because that diary ends very abruptly, it said he was a newspaper editor. And so
Uh,
I looked at all the Kentucky newspaper editors. I did that cross match, and I came up with William Hunter, because the family name today is not Hunter. The family name died out principally in the Civil War, because they basically took different sides, like a lot of families in the Civil War, and the Civil War decimated the male side of the lineage. But I was able to reconstruct a genealogy from William Hunter all the way back to the people that are alive today, and he has 50 cousins alive today.
well, well, that talk about being in the right place at the right time. I mean, to sit
Yes,
down and both of you, just I mean, good timing, and that's how it goes sometimes. Um, and then like what? I mean, this is kind of like a solve this mystery kind of thing. And that sounds really good. I mean, that's very clever of you to go through the soldiers and then the cross referencing it over that. It's a good puzzle piece. I'm sure there's a lot of genealogists out there who would be about this 100%. Like this is
yes.
a good a good case, I guess, to say it that way. Um, so I guess let's start, and you don't have to give all the details away by any means. We want people to um, go out and check out the book on their own merit and so forth. And let's real quick just we'll bring up your website here and just kind of talk a little bit about where people can get the book. That's the cover if you want to see it right there. You can get it on Amazon and other places. What's your preferred say if you want to get the book? Where do the people need to go?
Well, it's always as easy with Amazon, and
Mhm.
quite frankly, that's a lot of the sales. My publisher, that was Sunbury Press. They're a small publisher in Pennsylvania, and if you so desire to be able to support them, I would do that. One of the things that I might point out is that the book is available as an audio book for people that would like to listen to it. It's also available in on a Kindle, as well as in paperback and hardback. And it's funny today, the hardback has been discounted to almost what the paperback is. So
Oh,
it's just the vagaries of publishing today. But
mhm.
so it really is available any way people like to look at books, their preferred method.
Yeah, yeah, and the audiobook. I mean, I have 3 kids. I love sitting down and holding a book. That's my preferred method, but I don't always have time for that. So an audiobook is very convenient
Yes.
whenever you're doing all the things you're doing, and you can still enjoy the read. I got the picture up here of the journal. Um, so let's get started though. Let's talk a little bit. Where does this story begin?
Well, the story begins actually in Brunswick, New Jersey, when William's father, John Hunter, and his mother, Margaret, when they arrived in Brunswick a few months later, William was born. William was their second son, and uh, his father was actually had really good relationships. Everybody thinks about the British Army in North America as being bitter relationships and the Boston Massacre and all that kind of thing. But the 26th Regiment and William's father in Brunswick, they actually had a good relationship. They had balls and parties and feasts, and when the town got in trouble, with various natural disasters, the troops helped them out, and so it was actually a pretty good relationship. It wasn't the enmity that we hear about in other parts of the country. Um, but shortly thereafter, his father was transferred. The regiment was transferred to Montreal, So he actually, the first school he went to was a French school in Montreal. And we'll come back to France because
Okay.
France is part, and French is part of this story. And then at that point in time, that's when the American Revolution broke out and Lexington Concord happened. And as people from the Revolution know, that Ethan Allen captured Fort Ticonderoga certainly shortly after there, and then the Americans started to invade Canada. And his father was sent to thwart the American invasion at a place called Fort St. John, which is basically on the U.S. Canadian border above Lake Champlain. And in this siege of this fort, his father was egregiously wounded. Basically, he was a shell came in, exploded some gunpowder, and burned him pretty badly. So when the fort capitulated, William was reunited with his father, and back then you went into captivity. The families went into captivity with the soldiers. We think that's
Oh,
can't
wow.
believe that today.
Wow. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And so he actually spent the winter in another fort called Fort Chambly while his mother nursed his father back to health. And then they went down to Lancaster, Pennsylvania to a prisoner of war camp. Uh, then after that, he was exchanged and went back into combat.
Wow.
And there's a heart wrenching story in the book that I think listeners might be interested in. And this was there was a his father was sent up into the Hudson River Valley to attack these two rebel forts, and it was vicious combat in these forts. And so the son knew that his father, was looking for his father to come back. And these wagons of dead and wounded soldiers came back into New York City. And William went from wagon to wagon to wagon looking for his father. And you could just, through the pages of the diary, just see the palpable relief for him not finding his father.
Yeah, that would be I mean, a gut-wrenching moment to read and also and to experience as well, that, hope. I do wanna bring back a point you kinda mentioned about the relationship, and, you're correct. A lot of people don't realize, like, that people got along. Not everybody was ready to go to war with everybody, and,
Right.
you had loyalists and then, uh, uh, American forces, you had people all over, just like a lot of people, talk about Civil War, North and South. Well, it was kind of similar in the Revolutionary War. Not everybody was ready to go forth, and not everybody hated everybody. I guess to say it that way. Um, so continuing on with his father's service there, um, he's not found then, or he's not. He
Right.
doesn't find him.
Exactly.
What comes next?
Well, so then his father spends the next couple of years really in big skirmishes, foraging raids, in continuous, highly kinetic combat. And his father at this time was in his early 50s, and what back then they called he was just worn out. I mean, it's like today, if you're in combat for a year or so at a time, you just can't keep going. I mean, it wears on you, wears you out. And so his father was sent back to Britain on a recruiting mission to recruit more soldiers to come to the United States because each regiment did its own recruiting. So it's something, again, different than today. So he was sent back another a transatlantic crossing, and they got within sight of England, and a French privateer came and captured them. So he was captured a second time. He spent a year in Le Havre, France, which is in Brittany, in a prisoner of war camp there. If you can believe that.
Well, it's I always find the interesting talk, finding out about different soldiers who got captured, British or American, and eventually, some of these are let loose, and they always, you know, under the terms that you promise you will not raise
Right,
arms against Britain or
right.
America again, and it's like no one ever listened to that. I don't think
No,
so.
no. Yeah, and there's actually a Kentucky connection to that stay in France.
Mhm.
His mother gained expertise at treating burns in the Canadian experience. And when they were in France, one of the local noblemen' children was burned. So she went and treated this child. And as a thank you, they invited her to a party for which honored Marquis de Lafayette.
Okay.
And so
Yep.
when Marquis de Lafayette came to Kentucky in 1825, William and his wife, Ann Hunter, attended a dinner with Lafayette.
Those connections are, I mean, that's a crazy thing to think about, how that, goes about, how that unfolds, to think that here he is, his mother was, in France treating somebody who then he would have dinner with, that, all in Kentucky, not to, you
Right.
know.
Yeah, it's amazing connections. And then he goes back to Britain. They finally gets exchanged, goes back to Britain, and then he becomes a printing apprentice, and then starts to earn a living as a printer. And then he became a disciple of Joseph Priestley, and who advocated freedom, egalitarian um, ideals. And Priestley was persecuted in England, and so he just said, I want to go. I want find free speech. So he came to the United States
Yeah.
to do that. He landed first in Philadelphia, moved to western Pennsylvania, and then in 1797 moved to Kentucky.
Mhm.
Uh,
And, it is, I find it interesting to think, and I mean, I know there's a million different reasons for war and whatever, but, to say, he's a British citizen who then, gets kinda plotted around, moves around for war reasons, and then goes to England, but then wants to come back to America
right.
for the free, free press and so forth. It's just amazing. Again, amazing kinda how people's journeys go. But
So he
anyway.
actually starts the really kind of the second newspaper. John Bradford started the first newspaper in Lexington, Kentucky, several years before
Mhm.
this. But William started a newspaper in Washington, Kentucky, which is really part of Maysville
Yeah, it
today,
is
right?
now,
It's
yeah.
kind of a historic area. In fact, if you go to the historic village in Washington, you'll see a plaque in front of a plot of ground which talks about William Hunter's printing operation. So the people in Maysville have commemorated William in that way.
Yeah, and another, I do this quite often, but plug for Maysville. A lot of great Kentucky history in Maysville. And now I think, not about 10, 20 years ago, or it's not been that long that, Washington was incorporated into Maysville. But yeah, like you said, it's right there beside Maysville. Really good place to go visit for early Kentucky history and a lot of other Kentucky history as well. Um, yeah. So what, with this printing, uh, as all goes smoothly, right? No problems.
Yes. Yeah. He kind of learns about America here in ways
Mhm,
that that he learns the complexities of America, I should say.
mhm.
When he first came to Kentucky, he printed a brilliant anti-slavery um, uh, editorials, and in fact, they were so different because he actually advocated for the education of enslaved people, which
Yeah,
was so far out there,
that's yeah,
right at
that's
that time.
radical. That is radical.
Yes, and he received a lot of blowback in the community. And then later on, he actually hires enslaved people to work in his businesses.
Mhm,
So it shows the complexity of the time and
mhm.
just what really happened at the time. Did something that it was also very radical at the time, that actually was very courageous. In 1798, John Adams signed into law the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made
Mhm.
criticism of government illegal, and they put people in jail. And William Hunter wrote the first editorial opposing those acts.
Oh.
And if you look at the record, um, the Kentucky federal prosecutor in Kentucky and in Pennsylvania recommended to John Adams to prosecute William as the first person to be prosecuted under that act. And John Adams said no. And he said no basically because he didn't think he'd get a Kentucky jury to go along with that. He thought it'd be jury nullification,
Yeah.
and that they would not convict him. And so they convicted Matthew Lyons in Vermont as the first, and then Matthew Lyons actually moves to Kentucky afterwards.
There you go. Well, and, now I can't John Rankin, he is a big player there in the Maysville and the, Underground Railroad, but I was trying to piece it together. He probably is a little bit after Hunter's time, I'm thinking.
Yeah, I don't know. I would say that when Hunter first moved to Kentucky, there
Mhm,
were two kinds of settlers. There were settlers from Pennsylvania. They didn't have many enslaved people. Most
mhm.
enslaved people came from Virginia.
Yeah,
And so
good, yeah,
those two cultures moved, and eventually the Virginia culture took over and,
yeah,
and became the predominant culture. And so by
mhm,
the time William Hunter started his some businesses in addition to printing business and newspaper publishing, and he did a lot of manufacturing of hemp into
mhm,
ropes and cotton bagging, and so that
mhm.
was done principally with enslaved labor.
Mhm. Yeah, and Maysville, I believe, was a big, producer of the hemp and all that,
Yes, yeah.
um
Then after that, he William had an eye for politics, and he always and so he when Frankfort looked like Frankfort was going to be the new capital of Kentucky,
Mhm,
he
mhm,
moved from Washington to Frankfort, and he founded the first newspaper there, the Frankfort Palladian. Palladian is in the Greek and Roman kind of sense, and that newspaper was very successful, and he got the contract to be the state printer. And
uh-huh,
back in those days, that was the government's outsourced printing to a private contractor to in words we would use today. They didn't use those words back then.
mm,
But he would print the acts and the legislative proceedings and all the laws. And he got really pretty good at that. He did that for 10 years. Yeah, his newspaper was highly involved in the Spanish conspiracy, which many
uh-huh,
Kentuckians know
yeah,
about a lot about. And I think you've had podcasts on that
uh-huh.
conspiracy.
Yeah, real quickly, I'll show here and this is kinda what you're referring to, they printed the state documents, basically, or he printed the state documents, um
Yeah, yes, and I'll tell you kind of a unique story about this. These sold for about $5 a piece back then, which was a fair amount of money, and basically people that uh, purchased them were lawyers, and the court system
Mhm,
would buy them. There's if you get a complete set of that, which is about 17 volumes. That complete set I saw on rare book site sells for $22,500. So
whoa.
imagine that.
Wow, that would be great to have.
Yes. So he did publish early on some other things. He published some religious documents, some sermons, some. He was the first to publish a book describing the navigation of the Ohio River,
Mhm,
and so that was a big seller. But then later on, he really became a publisher of laws and legal documents.
mhm.
So that's how he made his money, and that's how the money's endured. So it's kind of amazing that he has a book. I do have one book. I do have a book of his that $1,000, but it's a it's another book that he did with a guy named Harry Tumlin, who was a early politician in Kentucky, and he's called the frontier Justinian because when Kentucky started, it started off as a amalgam of so when they tried to create, had to mash it all together, and so this Harry Tumlin basically unduplicated that and made it readable and into one criminal code, and that's what this book is. And so, and William Hunter published this
Oh, okay.
in 1804. So
Where,
it is,
where did you, get the book? Or that one?
I got this, believe it or not, I got this on eBay. So So it wasn't that expensive. But you know, the Henry his first book he published was a Spanish grammar book, and that's also very expensive because the Spanish conspiracy and all that. People wanted to learn Spanish, and so it's part of the rarity is that there aren't that many Kentucky presses from that period of time. He was one of the few people that was really him and John Bradford were the two
Yeah.
people that made books in Kentucky at that time.
Mhm. Well, and thinking about that, you don't nowadays we don't really think too much of who's making books because I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. You can get them. There's plenty of presses out there you can get them from. Um, but it was a very big deal because I mean, besides the newspapers, um, that was really the only other printed thing, correct? I mean,
Oh, absolutely. And you needed it because people had to understand what laws were being passed.
mhm,
You had to understand if you were in a courthouse in a rural area of Kentucky, you had to get the copy of the laws that they were passed at the legislature.
mhm.
So, you had to have some kind of printing here to be able to administer the government. And so that's what he did.
Yeah,
Um,
and I don't think I mean, I sometimes don't think about that as well, but if you have and this is a big way of why Kentucky counties are settled, why Kentucky is formed is, that distance from
right,
Kentucky to Virginia and the capital and so forth, getting that information is tough, so let alone do you have to have the distance to get that, then you have to have a means of getting the laws out there to say, "Hey, this is
right.
what's happened," and
That's right,
you got a legislator who meets, once, twice a year, and it takes them weeks to get there, then
right.
months to delegate, and then get it out printed. I mean, laws can be
Yeah.
6 months behind.
Exactly right. And what he did for his newspapers, he would actually have post riders. He'd put
Mhm.
newspapers on saddlebags on horses and send them out that way to distribute that. So his newspaper was distributed pretty principally throughout the state.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and because he was at the seat of the government, he had kind of first mover advantage. So what
Yeah,
was going on in the legislature, he could get out there first, right?
yeah,
Because they didn't
he
have
is the inside.
correspondence like we have today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. People, typing it on Facebook or whatever, letting you
Right.
know instantly.
Yeah, right, exactly. So he had a good run at that. He got to know a lot of politicians. The third governor of Kentucky was Christopher
Green up.
Greenup. He was
Mhm.
very good friends with Christopher Greenup. In fact, he was the executor for his will,
Oh,
for
wow.
example.
Yeah.
He wasn't quite as good of a friend with Henry Clay. They
Uh,
didn't see eye to eye. And though
yeah.
Henry Clay, there's a letter in Henry Clay's archives here at the Kentucky Historical Society, which says James Madison asks how what newspaper should he read in Kentucky, and Clay recommends William Hunter's Palladium. So
Well, I mean, that's a pretty good nod. I
yeah,
was
that's
gonna
a good nod.
yeah.
And then he goes off to fight a duel against Humphrey Marshall, who also didn't like Hunter either. So,
Yeah. Well, I was kinda thinking that the views on slavery, that might be one of the reasons they might not have him and Henry Clay might not have got along as much.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's probably right. I think that's a very good point, Jameson. A very good point. So he did that. He did a lot of politic in that time. But then he became really enamored with Andrew Jackson, as well as
Mhm.
did a lot of other Kentuckians. And it's he supported Andrew Jackson. In fact, he supported him so much that he went to Louisville because Louisville was not a part of the country, part of the state that really had a lot of Jackson supporters. So he went
Mhm.
to Louisville just to start a newspaper called the Louisville Gazette, just to his get Jackson's supporters riled up
Mhm.
in Louisville.
Well, and I mean, the newspaper and stuff is very the news can be very political now, but I mean that's quite um, you know uh, uh, interesting to say he went to Louisville just to get that support going, just to
That's
get.
all he did because they started it up about 4 months before the election, and 2 weeks after the election, they shut the paper down.
Wow, wow. Uh, well, you got your reasons, you got your purpose. Once you're done, you can go.
Yeah, and you know what, William did a lot of things in Kentucky. He was on the commission to build the second capital of Kentucky.
Mhm,
He was on the commission to start the what was called the Kentucky Seminary in Frankfort, which was not really a seminary in a religious sense. It was a school
mhm,
for men and women, and so he was interested in very. He had some daughters, and he was very interested
mhm,
in female education. He was a town trustee in Frankfurt for over 10 years. And so he
wow,
did a lot of community activities. He was
mhm,
very involved in the community. Um,
yeah. Again, I bring up another this map here, and to kind of get people a little bit of an idea. So up here on the right, that right there is Washington, and then Frankfurt and Louisville. So he was very much in the midst of the bluegrass, um,
yes.
politically and entrepreneur wise as well.
Yes, he saw hemp was a real it was a boom crop. You know,
Mhm,
at this point in time, cotton was just starting to become a big deal, and they call it cotton bagging, which is kind of a misnomer. But basically, you used hemp to contain the cottons and create the cotton bales. And
mhm,
so that was very big business. He ran a cotton bagging business on the Kentucky River. He basically could bring the hemp there. You would cure it and work with it, and then put on boats on the Kentucky River and send it down to the Mississippi Valley, where the cotton producing areas were. So that was his business for a long time. Unfortunately, the Panic of 1819 came along, and people don't maybe don't always appreciate the impact of that. Almost every business went bankrupt, including his business. It basically the bottom fell out of the market. There was prices went down. Couldn't pay back his loans. It's a heavy capital business. You buy the hemp at the beginning of the season, and you make it, and you don't get money until that ship comes back up the Mississippi River. And
mhm,
so it's a highly capital intensive business. And so he basically couldn't recover his investment. Went bankrupt. It was kind of embarrassing because he was a director of the Frankfurt State Bank at the time, and he had protracted litigation over that bankruptcy that would bedevil him for the next 10 years. Um,
mhm.
he was one of he almost went to debtor's prison, but Kentucky got rid of debtor's
Right
prison
there.
about a year before.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's also let's talk. So you mentioned his daughters. Let's talk a bit more about the family that he had. And another question: did his father ever make it to Kentucky?
No, that's a sad part.
Hmm.
So when he before he came over here, probably his father didn't last much past 1783.
Hmm.
His father got a pension from the British government, went to something called the Chelsea Hospital. He didn't actually go as an inpatient, but as outpatient kind of person. And his father probably passed. We don't have records of when his father's passed, but we know his mother and his sister, he had a younger sister, moved to Lisbon, Portugal,
Yeah,
and they moved with relatives because he didn't have any money. What it's not like today. There was no survivor benefits on the pension,
yeah,
so
yeah.
it was gone. So she went there, and he never saw his mother again.
Wow.
He in documents he views himself as an orphan.
Hmm.
um, he did send a letter to the American Trade Council in Lisbon inquiring on his mother and sister, but unfortunately didn't get
Get arrested.
any response at all. So
Hmm.
it's fairly unfortunate. He did start a family. He married a woman that lived in Bedford, Pennsylvania, on kind of on his way migrating west. Her name was Anne. She provided a inheritance that he actually used to start his businesses. And so, and she was his partner in every way,
Hmm.
and very much his partner in every way. And back then, she probably kept the books. She probably he had a retail store. She probably managed that. She probably did some of the printing. She probably pulled the press like everybody else. I mean, this
Hmm.
is no one sat around and did nothing. I mean, these people worked hard, and
Yeah.
she was a very smart woman, a very capable person, and so I think she did a lot in his businesses, and uh, they were partners in every sense of the word.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, he
So
had probably had 5 children. There are 2 children that are hardly in the historical record. I believe the only thing we know about them is they were inoculated for smallpox, and then they leave the historical record. So my sense is that they passed early in life.
mhm.
He had 2 daughters and a son, um, and his one daughter predeceased him, and the son predeceased him. The
Mhm.
son did marry, moved to Alabama and married a Tubman, that this a descendant of this guy, so it's
Yeah.
another connection. And he was ended up being a captain in the Texas regiment, and passing away in the Civil War.
Mhm.
And we'll come back maybe to his time in Washington. I'll tell you a story about the Civil War, which is pretty interesting. But and then his older daughter was probably not very uh, good with money. She was not good with money.
Uh-huh.
She was unlucky in love. She married a person from the next county over in Kentucky. That didn't work out for unknown reasons. And she'll marry again, someone like 30 years older than she is. So
Mhm.
it's not a great story, and inheritance goes around her. So we know that she wasn't capable of managing money, and that's
Uh-huh.
about what we know. So I know he had a very loving relationship with his wife. It's very clear from his will and from some after activities that we'll talk about, that they had a very good relationship, but he had a tough family life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, being a even as a child, I would say, being a soldier's son, moving around a
Yes.
bunch, being in, prison or captive as well. Um, he definitely did. You know.
Oh yeah, and I can tell you a story about that. He During the War of 1812, he was in Kentucky, and
Oh
Kentucky
yeah.
played a large, outsized
Mhm.
role in the War of 1812. And Charles Scott was governor. Charles Scott was a general on the opposite side of William's father, John, at the Battle of
Oh,
Monmouth.
wow.
Yeah, so they
Wow.
faced off like this on the field, and and I don't think Charles Scott ever questioned William Hunter, and he actually questioned his loyalty to the United States. William was a major in the Kentucky militia. He was about 42, 43 years old at that point in time,
Mhm.
and he declined to volunteer to go fight the British. And some people questioned his loyalty. I actually don't. I think he
Mhm.
was at that point in time, he had seen so much blood and gore and so much war as a child. Everything in his writing, everything he did afterwards was really not warlike. He
Uh-huh.
didn't want to become a soldier like his father. And
Yeah.
and I just think he just it wasn't that he didn't want to fight against Britain because he was a committed American. It's just that he just couldn't go to war. He
Yeah.
just seen too much of the ill effects of war.
That's kind of I can understand that. I mean, I don't, I can see why, especially at 42, by that time his father had been in numerous battles at that age. Um, so recommitting or getting involved in that, and again, if he had businesses and children of his own, um, then I could see the desire to stay.
Yeah, he just didn't want to do that. He did serve in government, and he
Mhm.
became a legislator. He was elected to the Kentucky Assembly. So it wasn't like that he was, opposed to our government. He supported our
Yeah,
government, right?
yeah, yeah. And by that time, by 1812, he would probably have been 20 some years in America,
Yes,
or about
yes,
that, yeah.
yes.
So,
So
and he came to America for the views and stuff, the press and all that kind of stuff anyway. So,
yeah,
I
and he was heavily involved in the building of the community, right? I mean,
mhm,
it was
mhm.
he set his roots down here. This was
Yeah,
his home, right?
yeah,
And I'm sure that if the British had come into Frankfurt, he would have fought, and that kind of thing. He would have done that,
mhm,
but you know, the expectation for him to volunteer to go to Canada to fight,
Yeah.
that's too much of an expectation, I think,
Hmm.
to
And,
have.
yeah, and he'd been in Kentucky by that time almost as long as a lot of people. There were other
That's right.
people. The only other ones you may be able to say is William Whitley, Isaac Shelby. Some of those
Right.
early settlers.
Very
Uh,
early settlers.
mhm.
Absolutely. But he ended up supporting, I said, Andrew Jackson. And Andrew
Mhm.
Jackson famously brought 75 editors with him to Washington, D.C. He understood the power of the press. And so he gave all these people government jobs. And he gave William Hunter a government job. William became an auditor in the Department of Treasury. He ends up serving Andrew Jackson and 8 more presidents. Uh,
Wow.
and
Wow.
he ends up staying in Washington until 1850. He died in 1854,
Mhm.
and his wife um, had such a great relationship. And you have up here, that's his grave here, which is perfect.
Mhm.
This obelisk here, this 8 foot obelisk, when Ann Hunter, his wife, passed, she stipulated no one's going to get any money until you build this obelisk first out of my inheritance. And so um, a son-in-law actually had this obelisk built. This is Congressional Cemetery. He's surrounded, and by the way, Ann Hunter's this little slab here, a great slab in front of him. So, and on the ground, and one of his other sisters is on the other side of him. And but he's surrounded by senators and congressmen and presidents, and so he's really buried with the political elite of his day in this congressional cemetery in D.C. It's a wonderful place to visit. There's actually one spot left in that plot. So I always kid the family. I said, well, you're going to have to draw lots as who can get buried next to him. So,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's very true. I mean, that's a pretty honorable place to be. And
yes.
again, which I mean, looking through the story, I mean, he's had a very interesting life, a very good. I mean, let's say it like this now, a story to tell, a very interesting story.
Yeah. And, when he passed, several, I guess many Kentucky newspapers published his obituary.
Hmm.
So even though he moved to Washington, people viewed him as a Kentuckian, and they
Yeah,
celebrated his life with through obituaries that were there.
yeah.
And the obituaries are very, very positive. And they mention him as being they call him the spirit of '98, which meant that he was commemorated his opposition to the Alien Sedition Acts. And
Ah,
yeah, and so they viewed him as a Democrat, a Jeffersonian,
mhm.
and they kind of go back to his support of Thomas Jefferson in the time. So he's viewed very positively as someone that kind of started things off right for Kentucky.
Yeah, yeah, wow. A very interesting, I mean, story all around to think, the process from father, British soldier, he's bounced around, goes to England, he moves back to America, ends up in Kentucky, sets up all these things, and you're talking about the Capitol, the newspaper, all these things, and is very involved. Then goes to Washington, D.C., and is heavily involved there as well. Um, Geez, what'd you say? 50 was it 1854 when he died?
1854, yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Wow.
he was
So
86 years old when he passed.
wow, wow, and gee, yeah, that is a lot
And
of
he
presidents
worked
too.
every day until he died, and he never got a pay raise in
Wow.
Washington.
Huh. That's unique for people working in Washington, I guess.
I guess the only thing I would say is that this is it's a quintessential American story, I think, and it's an immigrant story. It's someone that has that went faced a lot of adversity and overcame a lot of adversity. Someone who uh, uh, was able to kind of live the values of our country. So I think that's why it's a compelling story for people to learn more about.
Yeah, and I agree, and of course, I'm a little biased because there's a lot of Kentucky history thrown in there as well. But again, we don't always have these stories that kind of tie in with American history as well, and this one fits both the Kentucky history aspect and that American history. Um,
Yes.
so I can't encourage. encourage it enough, again, I'll show uh, the website here, and it's just geneprocknow.com, and you can see the book cover, and how to order it as well. I will put a link to the in the description on how to um, purchase the book as well, so anybody who's interested can uh, get it.
Okay.
Anything else before we go?
No, I think that's great. I just it's a wonderful story. It's a story that I think people will relate to.
Yeah,
Certainly
I,
glad that I sat next to that woman that I didn't know at the dinner
no.
party.
How convenient, or I mean, just the universe aligned, I guess. Again, well, Mr. Procknow, thank you so much for joining us. Well, before we go, any other books in the line or anything else? Any other works you got coming out?
Well, I had something published in the Journal of Military History this month on Charles Lee. He's a
Okay.
very controversial person, so that's out there. I do publish on the articles in the Journal of American Revolution, and I've got an article that came out this week on that too. So it's fun. So
Yeah.
a book I haven't got a book yet coming yet. So but we're working on that.
Well, anytime you got something that connects to Kentucky history, you make sure you let us know. Come on, you're more than welcome to come on and talk about it more. The invitation is out there.
No,
Um,
thank you.
but thanks again for coming on and joining us. Again, the book is William Hunter, Finding Free Speech, a British Soldier's Son Who Became an Early American. I would alter that maybe to say even became an early Kentuckian. Uh,
Well, I probably should have done that.
Uh, but anyway, thanks again for coming on, and thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.